We're going to go ahead and go to
Trinity Corner.
That's right, Trinity Corner time. So we're going to talk about the Word of Yahweh today. And this is...
very exciting.
Yes, this is going to be about getting into the biblical theology of it.
This is like one of my favorite.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Yeah.
Today we're going to talk about the Word of Yahweh. So John 1:1 is very familiar to most Christians, but what I'm going to do today is I'm not really going to talk much about John 1:1. I'm going to talk about the Old Testament basis, what it's referring to.
Yeah, let's look at the Bible to see what the Bible is trying to say.
Yeah, see what it's trying
to
say.
How about that?
So we're gonna talk about Devar Yahweh. That's the Hebrew for Word of Yahweh, and in the Hebrew it's just those two words together: Devar Yahweh, Word Yahweh. So first of all, we're going to look at Genesis 15:1 and 2. This is the very first time that this phrase appears in the Bible. It says, "After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Abram, I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great.' And Abram said, 'O Yahweh my Lord, what will you give me? I continue to be childless, and my heir is Eliezer of Damascus.'" So, as I've done earlier parts in the series, I want to point out, that ancient Hebrew is very concrete. We often try to make things more abstract than they are. Like we talked about in Genesis 3, Adam heard the sound of God walking in the garden. We want to,
spiritualize it, because
that.
that's too real.
It's too real. Yeah.
That's kind of mind blowing when you think about it.
Yeah. So, in Genesis 15, it says something occurred in a vision. It says the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. Now, whatever else you want to say, a vision is something that is seen. So, if right away, if you're thinking in your head when you hear word of Yahweh, this is just what Yahweh says, or Yahweh's going to say something, and so the message of Yahweh or something is what it is.
He could have been seeing with his heart.
Right. Definitely.
Which is deceitful.
Yes. That's true. That's true. So first of all, it's in a vision. A vision is something that's seen. But I want to go through this passage a little bit, and I want you to kind of pick out, and I'm going to jump down a little bit. This is Genesis 15, 1 through 21. I'm not going to get that far. And I'm going to jump down a little bit through the stuff that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But I want you to kind of catch what do there's three speakers in this passage. There's Yahweh, there's Abraham, and there's the narrator. And catch what, especially at the beginning, and it'll kind of muddle toward the end, which I think is on purpose. But catch at the beginning who is calling who what. So what the narrator says, what Abraham says, what Yahweh says. So starting back at verse 1, it says, "After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram.'" Sorry, I just used to always call him that. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." Then Abram said, "O Yahweh, my Lord, what will you give me? I continue to be childless." Skipping down, "And Abraham said, 'Look, you have not given me a descendant, and here a member of my household is my heir. And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying,'" so the narrator speaking again, "'This person will not be your heir, but your own son will be your heir.' And he brought him outside." So he brought, who again is speaking? The word of Yahweh brought Abram outside and said, "Look toward the heavens and count the stars if you're able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed Yahweh, so that's Abram there. Abram believed Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, "I am Yahweh." So who's speaking? The word of Yahweh. The word of Yahweh said to him, "I am Yahweh, who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give this land to you to possess it." And he said, this is Abraham, O Yahweh God, how shall I know that I will possess it? And he said to him, take for me a 3-year-old heifer and 3-year-old female goat. And it goes on to talk about the sacrifices there. And then down in verse 18 it says, on that day Yahweh made a covenant. Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land from the river of Egypt and on. And I'll stop there. So we have, at the beginning, it starts with the narrator saying, the word of Yahweh did this, and he did this and said this, and the word of Yahweh even said, I am Yahweh. So it doesn't really work for us to say this is just synonymous with like the message of Yahweh or something, what Yahweh is trying to say. Now in other verses in the Bible that is what it means, but in this passage it seems to be something else. We're seeing this used as a title for Yahweh himself, that Yahweh himself is being referred to as the word of Yahweh. And
sounds fancy.
Yeah. And there's not really plurality in this. If you watched last week's show, you know we talked a lot about plurality, especially in the Abrahamic narrative. This is one of the 3 times Yahweh appears, or Yahweh is encountered before that narrative with the 3 men in Genesis 18. And in each time there's a different name given. First it's Yahweh, this time it's the word of Yahweh, and then the third time it's the angel of Yahweh.
Seems to be interchangeable.
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah.
In this passage, definitely. I don't see the plurality thing, but I see an interchangeability, that this title is a title for Yahweh. And it doesn't just do this in this one text. So the next place we're going to go is 1 Samuel 3:1. It says, now the boy Samuel was serving Yahweh in the presence of Eli. The word of Yahweh was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. So here the narrator speaks of the word of Yahweh and says the word of Yahweh was rare and visions were not widespread. So once again, word of Yahweh and vision right there in the same verse again.
Like actually seeing a person.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So it goes on to say, then Yahweh called out to Samuel and he said, here I am. And Yahweh called Samuel again, so Samuel got up. Oh, and this one's gonna jump a little bit, so this is 1 Samuel 3 verse 4, then 6 and 7. So I'm skipping a little bit. Then Yahweh called Samuel again, so Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, because you've called me. And he said, I did not call you, my son. Go back and lie down. Now Samuel did not yet know Yahweh, and the word of Yahweh had not yet been revealed to him. So again, sort of this Hebrew parallelism, we see this, did not know Yahweh, word of Yahweh not yet revealed. So again, we've got this identification, or this very close association in the text. And then, but it's obviously Yahweh who's coming to him. Then verse 8, this will be verse 8, 10 through 11, 19, and 21. So skipping a few things in the middle. It says, again Yahweh called Samuel a 3rd time, so he got up and went and to Eli and said, here I am, because you called me. Then Eli realized that Yahweh was calling the boy. And then it says, then Yahweh came and stood there and called out as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, because your servant is listening. So Yahweh said to Samuel, look, I am doing something in Israel which will cause the 2 ears of everyone who hears it to tingle. And Samuel grew up, and Yahweh was with him. He did not allow any of his prophecies to go unfulfilled. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba realized that Samuel was faithful as a prophet to Yahweh. And Yahweh appeared again in Shiloh, for Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh through the word of Yahweh. So the whole thing is bookended with the word of Yahweh, and it's saying that when Yahweh appeared to Samuel, it was through the word of Yahweh. And again, this is kind of weird if it's just the speech or the content. It's more likely that this word of Yahweh is some kind of title or some kind of way that God is appearing. And
it
once
sure
again,
fits with John 1:1, doesn't it?
It
Wow.
really does. Yeah. And
Whoa.
it says, like, once again, we have physicality. You know, we have Yahweh stood there and called out as before.
Right.
You know, does an ethereal being stand? You know, and again, the language is very concrete. This isn't, you know, metaphorical language. You know, I stand at the door and knock or something. You know, this is Samuel is there, and Yahweh comes and stands and says, Samuel, and this Yahweh is referred to as the Word of Yahweh.
And you know, little kids, they're not like, they're pretty literal. He was a child, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He kept going to his caretaker saying, hey, did you call me? Like, he thought something literally was happening. So
Right. So, and again, the bookend thing, it's a very common thing in the Bible called an inclusio, where you kind of put the same terms at the beginning and end to let people know this is sort of a unit, and you put it in, often you'll put it in the middle too, to say this is the main point. I want you to catch this. I said it 3 times, and Word of Yahweh appears 3 times in this narrative. Mm-hmm. So it's a very powerful passage to just make us start thinking of this phrase not as just words, but as God Himself. So then the third and final passage we're going to look at in detail is going to be Jeremiah. This is the call of Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 and 2, and then 4 through 9. It says, the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, among the priests who are in Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of Yahweh came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, the king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb I knew you, and before you came out from the womb I consecrated you. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Then he said, Ah, Lord Yahweh, look, I do not know how to speak, for I am a youth. But Yahweh said to me, you must not say, I am a youth, for to whomever I send you, you will go, and whatever I command you, you will speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares Yahweh. Then Yahweh stretched out his hand, and he touched my mouth, and Yahweh said to me, look, I have put my words in your mouth. So, again, we have this idea of the word of Yahweh coming to Jeremiah, speaking to Jeremiah, telling him things. We have, interesting, the word devar there does appear 3 times, just like in the Samuel passage. The first 2 times it's just devar Yahweh, but then at the end it says, I put my words in your mouth, and it's actually devara, the plural, and it's saying, I put my words in your mouth. And I think it's interesting that it does switch there from singular to plural, because...
What do you think of Devara Schumacher?
That's
Sorry, we're thinking of baby names, folks.
Yeah. So, that's an interesting thought.
It's like Gerard.
Yeah.
Isn't your dad's name Gerard?
Yes, my dad's
anyway
one of his names.
Side note.
So here we have, again, we have the elements we saw before. We have Word of Yahweh coming to, speaking, being treated as a title for just Yahweh. When the Word of Yahweh comes, Jeremiah just says, Yahweh, you're here. He reaches out and touches him, out his hand and touched his mouth.
Wow.
And he said, my words are in your mouth. And I think this is interesting. I put my words in your mouth. It's almost making a distinction. So it's using the word again, but because it's different now, because it's saying, I've put my words in your mouth, he's saying, like, the other times you saw word of Yahweh are not the same thing as this. This is something different than that. That was Davar Yahweh. That was word of Yahweh. This is my words, my message. This, now we're going to talk about the message before we weren't, So I think that's one way you could definitely look at it. And the interesting thing here, and this is the main point I want to that I think this establishes. In the Old Testament, there are definitely clear times established right in Genesis where, with the first mention of the Word of Yahweh. And again, that's important in biblical theology. What is the very first time this concept is introduced? How is it introduced? That's supposed to help us understand, what it means later on. So, it's seen as a title for Yahweh himself right at the beginning. And in fact, we know, that this was considered a title because of something called the Targums. So Targums were Aramaic, they exist today, but they were written concurrent with the Old Testament, typically, I think in the time between Old and New Testament. They were translations of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Aramaic. But they didn't see it as a thing where we need to translate every word exactly how it is. They were somewhat interpretive. Some of them very interpretive. But what the Targums do is over and over and over and over and over again, they take the word Yahweh and they change it to the Word of Yahweh. So all the places not every single one, but a lot of them, in your Bible where it says Yahweh said or Yahweh did this, one of my favorites examples of this is Jacob says, if you'll do this, then Yahweh, you will be my God. And it changes that to Word of Yahweh. Word of Yahweh, you will be my God. And so Word of Yahweh is definitely considered to be a title for Yahweh at the time of Christ. These were written in that period of time. And so the Jewish people at that time who spoke Aramaic would read these Targums, and they would think of this term Word of Yahweh as just one title for Yahweh himself. Now, I don't have enough time to dig into that too deeply, and obviously I don't have any time to really dig into the New Testament and all of that, but when you look at all this, yeah.
This is just like a real tiny side note. This reminds me, no one has seen God or heard his voice. There has to be, this clears that up. The difference between
John
God.
1:18, no one has seen God at any time.
Yeah.
But the unique God, the one and only.
Except, Jeremiah had Yahweh's hand come out and touch his mouth, and Samuel had Yahweh standing there. So that just, it just goes to show the distinctions between Jesus and God the Father. Yeah, so when you hear this, when you understand this background, now we really, we don't have to go all over the place into philosophy and other areas, to talk about Logos and John 1:1 and all this stuff. We've seen it. We see what the Word of Yahweh is. It's right there in the Bible.
And it says, and so think about that when you read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.